So I'll stop the share. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name's Christy Mansfield. I'm the CEO and co-founder of SEER Data and Analytics. As we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the different lands we're on today. And I'm joining you from Gadigal land, people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge continuous connection to land, sea, culture, language, people and place for all First Nations people. We'll be recording this session today and really grateful that you could join us for what we think is a very exciting kickoff to our data sharing for community benefit roadshow. As I get started, I'd like to introduce you to our two guests today, Dr. Ian Opperman, who's the Chief Data Scientist of New South Wales, a Director of SEER Data and Analytics. Ian has over 20 years' experience in the ICT sector, has led many organisations, has been a pioneer in data sharing in New South Wales, and initiated many important pieces of policy and work across New South Wales government to support an authorising environment for data sharing. He's also leading the data usage standards internationally and is on the board of the IEC. So we're going to hear from Ian about data sharing and why this is a very important moment for community data sharing, community-led decision-making. We'll hear from Ian in a moment, and please, throughout the webinar, do drop your questions into the chat. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the session today. Our other speaker is Amity Durham. She is the Public Sector Strategy Lead at Amazon Web Services and is an experienced public sector leader and advisor with a passion for improving impact and quality of service delivery, especially in health and human services sectors. For the past 2 years, Amity has been working with Amazon Web Services as a strategic advisor in their public sector business. This includes developing strategic initiatives with public sector organisations to demonstrate how data and technology can help achieve better outcomes for citizens and communities. And prior to that, Amity held senior executive positions in the Victorian and New South Wales government in policy and innovation roles. Thanks for being here today, both of Amity and Ian. Ian, would you like to kick us off? Could you share with us why is now such a pivotal moment in the community data sharing movement? And could you share a little bit about the international shifts, what's happening in authorising environments, policy agendas, and how we're removing barriers to enable sharing of data for public benefit?
Thanks, Christy. Great to be here. There's been a lot of work happening in the background now for a very long period of time. We've understood that data is useful, valuable, important for a decade or more. And increasingly, we're starting to see that we can develop frameworks for using data, which is appropriate and which allows us to generate the value without exposing people unnecessarily to risk. I mean, it's data about people, and often it's data about vulnerable people or data about people in need. So what's happened in the last few years is not only a great appreciation of the value of data. COVID really showed everyone just how valuable data is. Not just data, the same sorts of data sets you've always been using, but data about adjacent areas, data about all sorts of non-traditional sources suddenly brought together, creating actionable insights, suddenly demonstrating that all of those little interesting things are actually really useful when you've got a crisis, and the pandemic was certainly a health crisis. So following from that point on, there's been such an incredible amount of effort put into developing frameworks for appropriate use of data, which helps us then think about the entire life cycle of data. So before you use it, as you use it, and then what you need to put around those data products in order to prevent unnecessary or unexpected harms. And increasingly, we're starting to see that you can do this in a way which really delivers value. So you mentioned standards earlier. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, especially on a Monday morning. There's been such a great deal of work done in standards around data and data quality, standards around data for AI and machine learning, and also data in general for thinking about those different points in the data lifecycle where you really need to think about frameworks for consideration of further use. And one of the challenges around data usage is that if you don't lock it down, then it's the next use or the next or the next use that really gets people worried about appropriate use of data and data products. So increasingly, we're getting a handle on how to build those frameworks. We're getting a handle on those ways of creating zones or layers of control, and also increasingly starting to think about data differently from just creating a data asset, which potentially creates a data problem, a honeypot data set, to thinking differently about how we create analytics, how we create insights, and how we create those safeguards around future data products. So a lot has happened. The need is there. Out of the unwilling, unable, not allowed, we've certainly seen the value. We certainly know that if we've got the right authorizing environment, then we can do it. And now the frameworks are coming that actually enable us to appropriately and safely use data and data products.
So Ian, can you talk a little bit about how you make that work to share data with communities? I mean, New South Wales, as you know, through the work we've been doing with Marinuka and many other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led organisations, has been pioneering this idea of sharing data to communities. I mean, through the Marinuka agreements, data sharing agreements with, for example, New South Wales Health, Western New South Wales Local Health District, it codifies data access and sharing for Marinuka in the context of ongoing community-led decision-making and self-determination. It's an agreement that we think is really pioneering and leading the way. For example, it provides data access and sharing on an ongoing basis. It is released on a quarterly basis. Marinuka is able to access that data with counts below 5, yet is trusted and is responsible for suppression of that data if it's shared outside. It's able to be renegotiated and expanded, and really cements Marinuka as a leader to access that data. What are your thoughts on how this scales into other, what are your thoughts on how it scales, and what is the opportunity here for?
So there's a couple of really important points about what you've raised, but ultimately they all come down to trust. So at the end of 2019, I actually went out to Bourke to sit amongst a community consultation or community conversation about individual cases. So we had police talking to education, talking to health, talking to family community services, as was, and talking about creating services wrapped around individuals as opposed to someone who was having challenges engaging with police and then separately engaging with education and separately engaging with other parts of government. So that sitting and sharing information at an individual level about complex cases was actually a much, much better way to think about a more holistic delivery of service, which was designed around the person as opposed to the person running into different parts of government or running into different parts of just the way services are delivered. That is something which is really powerful, but it's something which is challenging to scale. What you really need to do is people come together and sit and talk to each other in the sort of environment we have right now. But it's very effective when you can do it. The second element of trust is that people need to see themselves in the data. So a community needs to see data about themselves. And these are lessons that we learned from some great work that was done in New Zealand almost a decade ago. It's not just good enough to consult with community, but it's really important to give people back data about themselves in a way which they can really use it and have it done in a meaningful way. And again, scaling that is really one of the challenges. And then finally, it's about what happens to the data after it's used. After you create those data products, whether it's an insight, whether it's a report, what happens to it and what are the consequences of that? So there's always an element of vulnerability, if you like, if you share data about yourself with organizations or with people. If good things come from that, and if you can do so in a way which constantly builds trust, then the ability to start to scale becomes possible. And you can start to do all those good things that we want to do with data in a way which brings people along, helps people understand the consequences of that sharing, but also not only delivers what people expect, but constantly reinforces the fact that there's a whole lot of potential downside, which doesn't happen because the data is being shared and used in a trusted framework.
So just speaking about scaling, there's a number of international shifts in the authorizing environment's policy agendas. What is the impact of an international data sharing standard? How does that help scale trust and speed up access to data for community-led decision-making?
There are so many things that people are worried about when if you ask someone for data, the most likely response you're going to get is no. And the concerns very often are couched in terms of it's data about people, therefore there's potential privacy implications because you might be able to re-identify an individual. And if you can, there are not only legislative problems, privacy acts and so on, but also unintended consequences or unintended harms associated with use of that data or use of the data product. And over the course of the years, I've been trying to collect all those reasons and really try to identify what are the concerns. What are the concerns beyond unintended consequences? And there's a lot of them. There really is a lot, because data is a way of seeing the world. It's not the real world. You always have some distance between what actually happened in the world and what you're seeing in the data. And so there are issues of data quality, there are issues around the contemporaneous nature of it, there's issues around when the data was captured, what was the context with which it was captured. So starting to think through those and being able to identify for this use case, what are the issues I need to think about with regard to the data itself? What are the issues I need to think about in terms of how it arrived at my doorstep? What's the chain of custody? What's that authorizing framework? How much do I know about the data? And can I make a fair assessment of the fitness for the purpose I'm about to use it for? And then finally, when I create those data products, whether it's a report or whether it's a chart or an insight or an alert or an alarm, when I create that data product, what are the safeguards I need to put around it for that appropriate use, the restrictions, the prohibitions, the limitations, or the guidance I need to put around it? So we've tried to capture that concept of data lifecycle, the concept of all the things that happen to the data before it arrives at our doorstep, those issues around can we assess data quality and fitness for purpose? And with all of that information, what restrictions, guidelines, prohibitions can we characterize for the particular use case? All of that is being baked into these international standards. And it's not prescriptive to say, this is a particular situation, therefore you must do this and this. It helps frame the necessary considerations for people to make some judgments about what's appropriate for their unique circumstance, for their unique use case, but helps people, if you like, level set down to, this is the sensitivity of the data. This is what I know about the chain of custody. This is what I know about data quality. This is how I assess fitness for purpose. And therefore, for the next step, this is how I understand and build those safeguards for the next use, and then for the next, or the next use. And being able to think through those, think through issues of data quality, think through issues of necessary protections, it changes what is ultimately an infinitely complex conversation, which typically results in no, to a series of questions you need to ask and some level setting you need to do to help you make an informed decision and monitor for consequences of potential further use of those data products.
Ian, we've talked a lot about, how do we share data to communities for public benefit? How do you enable that environment for authorization and community-led decision-making, particularly when we're sharing restricted data that might be held by governments? I suppose the next curiosity I have around data access and democratization is in the realm of AI. Can you share a little bit? I mean, Victor Dominello, who you've worked with for many years, as a partner in the authorizing environment here in New South Wales, posted this morning around the access of AI and Gen AI. Can you explain what is Gen AI? And he talks about it being very disruptive and really to make sure that senior leaders across the public sector and not-for-profit sector are match fit. What does he mean by that?
Oh, that's a huge series of questions. Let me take up the rest of the time we've got telling
yes.
you. So back in November, something really fundamental changed in the world of AI. Up until that point, AI was a sophisticated use of data which did a couple of things. It would amplify, it would accelerate, and it would adapt. And so what I mean by that is it's an algorithm that scales up what you're trying to do, which makes it all happen a lot faster, and then will adapt over time. So what you develop versus what you ultimately deploy could be really quite different things. And we've been developing ways of thinking about that and assurance frameworks and different ways of putting in place those safeguards. What happened in November last year, so the new AI, the large language models and the generative AI, is that suddenly everything changed. So AI now could not only produce a song in the style of your favorite artist or an image in the style of your favorite artist, but could also do a couple of big things. So apart from amplify, accelerate, and adapt, it suddenly could generate, it could synthesize, it could translate. It could do these things that previously we thought really were the domain of human beings alone and uniquely its capabilities that we have. So what we're all doing now is coming to grips with these new capabilities of AI. And of course, every time we come to grips with the next version, the next comes out. So we have this incredible increase in capability. So what we're all trying to do now is think about what is the part of the use of these incredibly sophisticated algorithms trained on literally trillions of data elements, which parts still belong to us and which parts could we appropriately allow generative AI or large language models to use. And I think the post from Victor earlier today was AI, not AW, so artificial intelligence as opposed to artificial wisdom. There is still a really important role for we as people who use these tools, and they are really data-driven tools, to ensure that we are applying the judgment or the wisdom to the data products that come out. So a data product now is not just an insight or a chart or a report. It actually could be a whole series of different sorts of things that are delivered to us. It could actually be an entire report rather than just a chart or rather than just an insight. It could be something which looks like it's being composed by a human being, but as we've seen in different parts of the world, may contain some pretty fundamental factual inaccuracies. So the wisdom that we still need to apply is to understand when we should question more thoroughly, understand the process that led to the development of that data product, and be able to question, be able to interrogate, and be able to do the modern equivalent of check the sums on the calculator and just don't take the calculator's result as absolutely gospel. So we still need to ensure we are treating these new AI capabilities as tools. We still need to ensure that we understand enough about how they're generating these results so that we can apply wisdom, judgment, and also to think about appropriate use. So those safeguards around the use of the data product, whether it's a song, whether it's an image, whether it's a Christmas joke, those are still data products, and being able to understand the restrictions, the prohibitions, the guidance we should put around use of those products remains the task for us to do. And I hope as every next generation of AI comes out, we continue to think about these things as data products and we put around them those restrictions, guidance, and prohibitions.
So we're going to be discussing how to scale community data sharing, democratization of data, with Victor and Alastair Ferguson, who's the leader from Marinuka, and yourself, Ian, at our roadshow in Sydney, which we invite you all to attend in person. So we're very excited to have Victor and Alastair together with yourself in talking about the journey and then, you know, the wisdom and actions that are able to be taken from access to that data. You talked a little bit about scaling trust and trust itself. Can you talk about what you think the components of trust are to enable this authorizing environment?
Sure. So, I mean, again, there's a lot to that. So the easy stuff is being able to demonstrate that you've got an appropriate understanding of the governance necessary in order to handle the data and the data products. That's the relatively easy stuff. That's the engineering side of things. The bigger elements are demonstrating trustworthiness through the entire life cycle of use of data and data products. And that starts with how the data was collected, from where, in what context, and carrying that information forward. And then thinking about appropriate use. So once upon a time, there's a model out there called the 5 safes, which is a really simplistic way of thinking about how to use data. And it talks about people and technology and the environment. And I was once talking to an Indigenous woman about the 5 safes model, and she said quite simply, safe for whom? How can you demonstrate that what you're doing is safe? And that really speaks to the everything else associated with use of data and data products. If you create a data product, say it's a report, or say it's insight, or say it's something that says if you do A and B, then you're likely to get C. So a prediction, for example. The consequences of people being part of that prediction or part of the data sets that go to create that prediction can really change behaviors. So if people know that A and B predict C at 75% of the time, they may well stop wanting to be part of the data set A or be part of action B that leads to prediction C. So thinking about appropriate use is really the important thing. So being able to demonstrate that you've got security, that you've got transparency, that you've got an ethics model in place, that you protect privacy, but also think about inclusiveness. These are elements across the entire use of data and data products, which are absolutely essential to demonstrate trustworthiness. Now, you can't ask someone to offer you trust. You can constantly keep demonstrating trustworthiness in systems and use. But then when things go wrong, and at some point we know with data, the way we create data assets, the way we use data, there's always eventually going to be something that happens. So the question is, what do you do when it goes wrong? How do you ameliorate, how do you respond to those potential harms when they become real harms in the real community? So of course, thinking about them and minimizing beforehand is really important, but thinking about if there's a data breach, what do you do? Thinking about if someone does inadvertently receive some sort of harm, an inconvenience, an embarrassment, something that leads to a real harm, how do you deal with those? So there are many elements to it. Some of them, the easy parts are the technology, relatively speaking, easy parts of the technology, but it's the embedding of all of those elements of transparency, security, ethics, privacy, and inclusiveness through the entire use of data and data products. That's the really important part.
Thanks, Ian. So we'll get a little bit more into the work SEER is doing across the many communities. I guess with your help and with our focus in the next 6 to 12 months, our focus as a technology platform is to support platform flexibility for the many models of community data access and sharing, and to align to those best practice, security, privacy, compatibility with international data sharing standards. So they're the kinds of work we're doing. In addition to being a platform that enables flexibility for users and improving that experience for users, with our team that walks with so many of our organizations that we're working with at the grassroots, and also public sector and businesses that are sharing data with communities, which is a really exciting moment because we're proving together with community-led initiatives and governments and businesses that there's real benefit in sharing data for decisions and for self-determination. Amity, I wanted to ask you your experience, what you see is important at this stage now that you're working, of course, in technology, having come from the public sector.
Sure. So my background, as Christy said, I've worked in New South Wales and Victorian governments. And my most recent role in Victoria a couple of years ago was to lead a whole of department strategy and analytics function across health and human services in Victoria. And I think in that role, it became really clear to me all of the things we've spoken about the value of the insights that can come from data for making policy decisions, making investment decisions, but also really importantly, how government's monitoring impact of services and being able to be more transparent and accountable about the impact that government funding is having on the ground on people. And so in that role and the work we did there, we were able to use linked administrative data across the government and really start to understand how people were using services. And what became really apparent is that, as Ian said, people don't just use one service. You have particularly in vulnerable communities, people using multiple services, but none of those are joined up. And people's experience of the service system is very fragmented, duplicative, and really doesn't achieve the sorts of outcomes that you'd hope. So through that linked data, we could really start to think about the future of service delivery and really prove up a case for doing things differently. And so I think within government over the past few years, that's become much more, a regular way of working in using that kind of de-identified data within government. And starting to see some of that value come through in terms of the programs being understand impact better, and particularly in health and human services. But the time now, I think, and we're starting to see, that those sort of insights being made available to local communities. And I just think, this is a way of the future. What you find within government delivering services at scale, sometimes it's very removed from the impact on the individual and on the ground, whereas at the local level, being able to use data and information really helps to mobilise people on the ground that can have that direct impact. So if we're thinking about non-profit organisations who are working in communities, thinking about government services across health, social, justice services, being able to work together using good information really does help drive change. And so it's very much now the time for government, I think, and non-profits and business to think about how to share data much more as just a regular way of working. But as Ian said, in a very trusted environment as well. So all of those issues around data governance, regulatory frameworks are critical enablers. And I left government, I guess, to work more in technology just to understand the tech side better, because I do think there's a huge shift and rapidly moving, technological innovation that really helps make this happen at scale. So even within government, we would spend months and months linking data, building analytical models, and the time to action, is fairly long. I think now with technology, with cloud services and cloud technology and automation and the like, we can really start to think about how we use platforms like the SEER platform to deliver across communities at scale and much more closer to real time. So the information you're using is better, it's more recent and more actionable. So I think it's incredibly exciting time bringing together the regulatory arrangements, the policy environment, as well as the technological circumstances to start to see this happen at scale.
Can we talk a bit about the policy environment for a moment, Amity? Because obviously there's a number of Commonwealth national policies and state policies that line up to how do we do things better? How do we get better outcomes for Australian citizens to end entrenched disadvantage? Of course, that is primary policy for our Treasurer, and to implement national wellbeing measures. And we've seen that, of course, with the release of Measuring What Matters from Treasury. And then there's investments in re-looking at justice reinvestment nationally, the early years, employment strategies. It feels like the time is now. Why do you think that is? Why is it all lining up now?
Look, I think it's been talked about for quite a long time. I think particularly in social services, probably over the last 10 years, I think there's growing recognition that just delivering sort of services down portfolio lines at scale really isn't achieving impact or the sort of impact it could. So I think there's been growing recognition. I would see there's two things coming together from my observation. On one hand, we have a movement to place-based approaches. So thinking, government thinking differently about how it does business, how it intervenes, but also empowering communities to make local decisions and to do things differently. So I think that is a huge shift. The second thing, though, is, I guess, a growing willingness and recognition to measure impact more, and to really use data, whether that's linked data, but also expanding the way we're evaluating services, bringing communities in, collecting qualitative data from clients and communities about impact. So the two things, I think, come together really strongly and with data and technology as an enabler to enable, I guess, a vision people had a long time ago about how we would do this, but some of those critical enablers to do it across the board just weren't there, but are becoming much more available.
And I think what you're saying is true. I mean, this has been a vision for many people for many, many years. One of our key customers is the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Tasmania. And even though there was an agreement, which was called the Wellington Agreement, to share data with place-based initiatives or local communities, it wasn't until this year that it was made possible, and it had been an ambition for many years of many people in policy and also in the not-for-profit sector. Just driving into place-based work specifically, we hear a lot with the people that we're working with, those place-based initiatives, backbone organisations on the ground, that, in order for them to do the work that governments and other funding communities are asking them to do, it's not possible to do unless they have visibility of what's happening on the ground. Otherwise, they are blindfolded in their decision making. So this is, also a driving force for shifting the authorising environment and making that data available. What do you think the opportunities are for improving impact or outcomes once we overcome those barriers and really do make it possible for availability of data access?
Look, and Christy, you can probably answer your question too, because you've seen it happening across the board in all of the communities that SEER is working. But from my perspective, I think the real value, data is information, and it's not, I guess you can't translate that into impact or an outcome without the action that you take on the back of that data. So there has to be a couple of things sitting around that data sharing as well to enable communities to take that action. And so obviously provision of a data insight that's understandable, people can understand what it means, as Ian said, like what the data tells you, where it came from, how reliable is it. But once you have that insight, I think communities also need then the ability to turn it into action. So some of that might be thinking about the sort of discretion communities can have about funding. And so if we think about, say, in the Logan community in Queensland with the Stronger People, Stronger Places initiative, and Connected Beginnings as well, and the Queensland government is much more prepared to let that community have a pool of funding that it can make decisions about. So decisions about what services will be funded, or decisions about how to shift and change services as well on the ground, because often programs from government are set up with quite stringent requirements about, who should get the program, what the target group is, what the requirement is for the service model, how you evaluate. So I think, and how you measure the performance. So giving communities much more discretion about some of those key features can really help turn the data into the insight. And without that discretion, you're just giving insight, but without the power to actually do anything with it. And I think that's going to be critical going forward, thinking about the full set of enablers. Data technology is important, but it's not the end game. It's more about allowing people, to work within a trusted, authorised environment to make decisions and take actions.
And that is really the very exciting big vision of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
This deepening of democracy and democratic process for how decisions are made and how investments are made as well, in place, which I think is the purpose of community-led decision making, and we're certainly on this great journey toward that. So I would love to hear from anyone online if you have any questions at this point. Really keen to hear your perspectives, your reflections, any questions that you might have for Ian, Amity, or myself. From our side, we've been working on data access and sharing now for 7 years. We started with the idea to empower grassroots people in southwestern Sydney with access to data, how that could be more available, how it could be accessible faster for people to really understand context. And it coincided, I suppose, with the open data movement as well, and how data was seen as a resource that could be used more broadly. And just on the open data movement itself, there's been quite a lot of access to open data, sometimes in place. The data that's most useful is not publicly or open, and hence why our work to share restricted government data for place-based work. One of the problems has been that, data is published and yet not able to be used easily. Are there any reflections from your experience with open data, and where do you think the open data movement sits within this context?
Thanks, Christy. So open data was joined very closely to open government a decade ago, and there was a really important attempt to get data into the hands of people who could use it. And it came with a really serious concern about, well, what happens if we release this data? Those issues about unintended consequences, those issues about, is there a potential risk of re-identification? So as a consequence of that, despite the very, very positive momentum to release data, increasingly release useful data sets, the concern about release of the data is what really led to a lot of the goodness being boiled out of it before it was released. There have not historically been very many very useful data sets released. I mean, ABS produces good data, Opal card data, for example, being released are good data sets, but most people are really concerned about the unintended consequences. And so despite best efforts, not releasing a great deal of data. I think it's fair to say that the first time I encountered SEER was actually looking at some of the aggregates of those data products for southwestern Sydney and being able to compare this community with that community. And I thought that was a really great example of reintroducing value by doing things like compare and contrast. Show me communities like me, show me communities with these different social determinant factors. And for a lot of people, that suddenly gave a leg back up to, I want to consider all of the issues associated with this community, which are unique, in the context of these other issues where this community looks like that community. And I think also now increasingly we're getting better at understanding what we are releasing in terms of the levels of personal information. And again, the world of standards. I was a little dismissive about the technology earlier. I should point out that the standards we're working on, they're 5 years in the making. So it's been a really long, hard slog, but looking back, they look a whole lot easier than looking forwards. And putting those standards and frameworks in place really does allow you to make a more informed decision about which data sets can I release, which data sets can I combine together, and which ones should I really not combine together. And again, that's that guidance, restrictions, or prohibitions on different data product and data set release. So I think we're about to see a resurgence of open data. I think being able to measure and being able to understand the risks of re-identification in a more quantifiable way will genuinely help people feel confident about releasing data or releasing data products which are less sensitive or have a smaller degree of personal information, or which can be used in a wider range of ways because there have been some safety mechanisms built in.
Thanks, Ian. Did you have any reflections on open data?
Look, I think there's been a start with open data. I think it has focused on areas probably less about human, characteristics of people. When you look at the open data sets that are generally available, there's a lot of transport data, there's a lot of environmental data. I think, as Ian said, there's been more reluctance to release data about people for all of those reasons that we've spoken about. But I think what we're talking about in the community data sharing space is it's done much more in a partnership, in a collaboration between government and communities, and with a frame around what data is shared, how it's shared, and what insights are made available. So I think those concerns that might have been there in the past can be worked through, but it's not sort of a free-for-all, and the data that is released, much more open. If we think about it's more population level data, we're not talking about administrative service data, which obviously can be more sensitive there. But so I sort of see the community data sharing as a way to enable communities to have the sorts of insights from administrative data that's brought together with public data and community data, but in a trusted way, in a safer way. So it achieves the open data objectives, but in a way that's manages some of those risks.
Yeah, and when we're talking about community data hubs, or I saw some questions on examples of how this is being done. What we're really seeing is community-led initiatives pulling together publicly available data and open data that might align to key indicators for the community's deliberate strategy. Gladstone is a great example where the Gladstone region together have created its data hub. And there are many of these data hubs springing up all over Australia, and they all look different. Thank you, Tim, for your question for the Bega Valley Data Library as well. So it all is starting to come together in a very diverse and wonderful way so that communities can come together to understand population level data, and then community data that might be shared, as I said, from governments in a restricted way. But the other part of this is service level data as well. And, we're working with Restacking the Odds to support the availability of data across a number of different strategies for the early years as well. And that is the data that is service level to show what's happening on the ground and how what needs to change from the ground up to impact those population level data assets. So it's a very comprehensive view. You have, as you mentioned earlier, population level data, you have service level data, and then of course there's indicators to measure community sentiment and survey data. Bringing all of this together is really what the future looks like, and we're supporting many to step it out. What we often see, and just to the point of examples, what we often see is that place-based initiatives or community-led initiatives and collaborations come together firstly to understand context, and the first place that people go is obviously open data. And then when there's an agreement on what the community wants to work on and how that aligns with its partners, government partners and philanthropic partners, then there's a focus on, all right, well, how do we answer these questions to give us an indication on what we need to shift and what decisions we need to make as a result of the impacts we want to make. In the case of Marinuka, the Safe, Smart, Strong shared measurement framework really had cross-sector leadership agreement for data sharing. And this goes to the point that Meredith asked. Thanks, Meredith, for your question. Have we got any case studies about how we overcome concerns it really is that agreement that across government agencies, philanthropic and community, that in order to make the change that is needed, data must be accessible and visible. And so data requests need to move from a one-off request into a perpetual data sharing agreement. And that really impacts, that really affects the systemic barriers that we all see. So doing a data request is one thing, it's a point in time, but what we're moving toward in the new environments that we talked about is a codification of data requests in a sharing environment. And that is both a bottoms up and a top down approach that New South Wales has taken. But certainly what it does do is it means that, once we have those data sharing agreements in place for community, then that data, can be renegotiated, can be available at a regular cadence. It is important to say that an enabling and secure platform supports the negotiations for those data sharing agreements. And that's really the scalability that we're talking about. How do we think about scaling that out? Well, a mandate for data access and sharing is important, yet the operationalization of it is the next level. So how do you do it? How do you do it so that, for example, health data products can be made available to communities in different jurisdictions in a scalable manner? And that comes down to a number of things we've spoken about today, including the technology, the scalability, the trust, and the instruments such as data sharing agreements to enable it. So it's clear. But I suppose at the heart of it all is governance. The governance structures, the way decisions are made, and collaborative decisions, grassroots, community-led decisions with government and with other funders together. I'm curious, Ian, from your perspective, we've been working on this for quite some time, as you know. What are the key elements you think are going to unlock the scalability of this?
Thanks, Christy. I've been sitting here trying to think of an analogy, and the analogies are not going to be great, but I'm going to try one. So anyone can cook a meal. And if you have the same oven and the same set of tools and the same fry pans, we see it on MasterChef type programs, anyone can cook a meal. The difference is the philosophy and the care and the skill and the craft with which you actually undertake that process of making a meal. And you can have a very, very big difference, whether it's a boiled cabbage sort of experience or something which is a Michelin star experience. And so I said earlier, tech's not necessarily the hard part, but you do need to have enough of the technology to be able to do it appropriately. But it's really putting in place that philosophy of privacy, security, ethics, transparency, and inclusiveness, and thinking through, again, not only the way you collect and the way you use and the fitness for purpose, but also the potential, both positives and negatives associated with use of those data products, whether it's an alert, an alarm, a decision, or an action, or whether it's an insight or a prediction or a benchmark or whatever the product is. It's thinking through the use of those, but then also monitoring. So you talked about the putting in place perpetual data sharing agreements, or putting in place these longer term agreements which are not transactional. And I think that there's no such thing as set and forget anymore. Anybody that just deploys something and walks away from it does so at their peril, especially in a system where you're constantly generating insights. So that ongoing monitoring of the potential harms or the potential consequences and the potential unexpected outcomes is something which is really important. And I also mentioned at some point, we have data breaches, they happen. We have unintended consequences, they happen. So not only thinking about how to prevent them, but how to respond to them and potential harms when they happen is also part of it. So it's constantly embracing that philosophy of all the things we need to do to make that experience as good as possible, to really exercise the craft and the thoughtfulness and the philosophy of security, transparency, ethics, privacy, inclusiveness is the difference between having that boiled cabbage experience versus getting a Michelin starred experience. I'm just having flashbacks to my childhood about boiled cabbage. But anyway.
And it sounds like something none of us want to experience as well. I've got a couple of other questions. Thanks, Ian. In terms of using data, thanks, Carly, for your question. In terms of using data at a community level, place-based approaches, I'd like to think communities would need person level data in order to inform decision making. Is that right, do you think? So just to be clear, data is shared with communities at restricted level, aggregate, I should say. It's not unit record level data. Amity, did you have a thought on this?
Yeah, and I'd just add to that, there's two types of data. There's one using the de-identified aggregated data, and communities can use that for decisions like understanding community needs, understanding what services are being delivered, and understanding sort of cohorts or groups of people who might need services and how effective those services are, and how you might modify some of that to predict better outcomes for people. So I think there's a huge use case there around that de-identified aggregated data. I think the other is the identified person level data, and Ian, you flagged that Marinuka, they have the service providers sitting around the table, and they can use identified data for case management purposes. We also see a lot of that in, say, family violence as well, where there's legislative rules about how identified data can be used for case intervention and case management. So look, that's another potential use case, but obviously that has to be done with a lot more sensitivity, care and rules around how that data is used, because that is about individual people and families and how to improve a service and an outcome for them. So there's two different types. I think the SEER platform that we're talking about is working more in that aggregated space, enabling local decisions more at that service level, and service planning and service effectiveness level. But certainly there's other examples too where you can use identified data. Yeah.
And Amity, a follow-up question from Kylie, which is she's talking about communities would need a person level data, but she's also asked about security and ethical implications providing aggregate data at a local level when it can be potentially identified because of sample size. And so this goes to the point of every custodian will have rules around suppression, or even suppression of low counts, or even perturbation and other security measures that we, as a platform provider, are looking to put in place. Ian, do you want to comment further on that at all?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned that I've been working on international standards around data usage, and this issue comes up again and again and again. And without jumping into a standards language, there are a couple of issues to consider between the world of open data and closed data. So between personally identifiable data and the sort of things that we'd release as open data, we can create shades of grey. We can create a very high control environment, which would be appropriate for use of personally identifiable data, or data which is reasonably personally identifiable. We can then create a high control, moderate control, low control, no control. And just that separation between, I need to work in a highly controlled environment because I'm dealing with reasonably re-identifiable data, versus I'm going to boil the goodness out of it and release it as open data, and I'll aggregate it so much. There are ways of doing that level setting so that you can decide based on the sensitivity of the data and the data products, based on the level of personal information of the data and the data products, based on your particular use case and therefore the need for those different data products. You can do that level setting around who gets access under what controls, and is there a specific legal framework you need to put in place above and beyond your normal authorizing framework? Can you rely on your normal authorizing framework with restrictions on how you use it? Can you rely on your normal authorizing framework under normal business conditions? Can you share more broadly? Can you share with everybody? So where I'm hoping that all organizations who use people-centric data will go to are those layers of control, and being able to do that level setting to say, okay, based on the data that we've got and the use case and the authorizing framework we have with the community we're going to share with, this is the layer of control we need. These are the restrictions we need to put on the use of the data and data products. These are the commitments that we make. These are the commitments that we want the community to make. And if we can't have that, then we have to change the level of personal information and reduce the sensitivity of the data in order to share that more broadly. And that philosophy sounds really simple, but that's 5 years worth of really serious discussion, contemplation, engagement at an international level to get to the point where we say, it's more than open and closed. It's more than personally identifiable or reasonably personally identifiable versus general aggregated data. And the data products we create could be, as Christy was saying, they could be data which is aggregated, data which has suppressed elements, data which has noise injected, so perturbed, and creating those data products whilst maintaining the utility of your use case is really the important thing. And there's been just a quick little plug, been some great work around that perturbation, working with the good folks at Data 61 around this thing called OptimShare, which is an example of being able to create data products which are still useful, but increasingly reduce the level of personal information and reduce the level of sensitivity.
Thanks, Ian. And last question from Tim, and I did drop in the link to sign up for our in-person event in Sydney and also in Canberra coming up soon. We have the dates yet to be confirmed in Brisbane and Melbourne, but would love to see you come along. Finally, a question from Tim Whitaker. This is a good question. Are communities ready and willing to adopt place-based data-driven decision-making? We believe so. We're seeing it. We're working in this way in more than 50 communities around Australia, and that's scaling out. What do you think, Amity?
Yes, I like the short answer is yes. And I think there's also more effort and probably time and effort spent, I guess, building capability locally as well. Things like technology platforms can make those insights easier to understand, to make it more accessible. But there's, I guess, also ways in which we can empower communities by building, whether that's data literacy, digital capability, and then the ability to pick up and make use of what's available in the most effective way. So I'd say yes, but there's still probably a readiness capability piece that has to sit alongside this being rolled out at scale. Yeah.
Thanks, Amity. What about you, Ian?
Look, I absolutely agree. I think as more and more people see the benefits of place-based use of data, more and more people will develop confidence. But then it's still a conversation community by community about demonstrating that trustworthiness. But I think increasingly it's becoming the way to do things. It really is quite powerful.
Thank you. So for people who are based in Sydney, we really hope that you do join us for the 5th of October here in our office at the Sydney Startup Hub with Alistair Ferguson, Honourable Victor Dominello, with Ian, myself. We'd love to see you to continue the conversation. We're going to go into some detail about how it's happening in New South Wales. It will also be live streamed if you are outside of Sydney. And then in Canberra, so you can register there. Then we have another event coming up in Canberra as well, which is on the 23rd of October, and we'll be able to confirm speakers shortly. Very excited for that one as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Amity. Thank you, Ian. And we look forward to continuing the conversation and to working with you all to enable data access and sharing for community-led decision-making. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.